You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 31st of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, two of France's former prime ministers reach a truce after divisions threaten to tear their party in two. We'll examine the state of the Renaissance group as it struggles under internal and external pressures. Also coming up, China changes economic tack to try to rebalance the books. We'll ask how and if it'll work. Plus,
a few reasons, because it's very complicated and I'm undecided about some local candidates as well.
We'll be in New York to hear how close races outside the city could shape control of Congress. There'll be the papers and the fashion news too, and
where I'm standing here next to this beautiful fountain, around about when it was built, this was also the main hotspot for the burning of witches.
Our man in Copenhagen visits a new exhibition that explores the dark chapters of the city's history and celebrates the modern-day joy of hex. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. Soldiers have joined emergency rescue efforts in Spain, where the worst floods in decades have killed at least 95 people. At least 19 people have died in Israeli airstrikes on the Lebanese city of Baalbek. And Argentina's President Javier Milei has sacked his Foreign Minister Diana Mondino after the country voted in favour of lifting the US economic embargo on Cuba at the United Nations. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, in the last year, even less perhaps, France's ruling party has been an example of just how quickly and brutally both power and respect can be lost. When Emmanuel Macron called a snap general election this summer, he not only diminished his party's numbers in the parliament, but also caused havoc among his senior leaders. Two such figures also happen to be former prime ministers, Gabriel Attal and Élisabeth Borne. They've been battling it out for leadership of the party, only reaching agreement in the last day or so. Well, to tell us more and to examine the wider implications of what this means for France, I'm joined now by Simon Bouvier, who's Monocle's Paris bureau chief. A very good morning to you, Simon.
Bonjour, Emma. How's it going?
Very well, thank you. Bonjour, Simon. Now, so what's happened between Élisabeth Borne and Gabriel Attal in the last few days?
Well, Emma, essentially this is kind of emblematic of the changing of the guard in what used to be the presidential party. So what happened is, after the snap election that you mentioned, the former head of the Renaissance party, Renaissance is what it's known as now, but it was originally back in 2017 when Emmanuel Macron founded it, called En Marche! He got a new job at the European Commission, and so the position of party boss opened up, and Élisabeth Borne, who was Gabriel Attal's predecessor as prime minister, was the only candidate until yesterday, when Gabriel Attal, the previous prime minister, previous to Michel Barnier, declared that he was going to run for the post, and she essentially cleared the way for him to become the new party boss.
So effectively, Élisabeth Borne has had to pretty much sacrifice herself here. Why has that happened?
Well, essentially, they had been kind of arm wrestling over who would become the new head of this party ever since the snap election. And I think she realized that she didn't have the popularity with the party's base that Attal has, and she couldn't really stand in his way. But the real battle was over whether or not Attal would be allowed by the old guard of the presidential party to have two jobs at once. The first one, which he already has, is to be the head of their group inside the parliament, so essentially being their parliamentary general, if you will. And now he's going to get to have the second job of head of the party at the same time, which is going to allow him to kind of mold the party to his very explicit, I would say, or not explicit, but the worst kept secret in Paris, his presidential ambitions for 2027.
How much is there, as a result of what's happened in the last 24, 48 hours, signs that there is a desire from the upper echelons of Renaissance, at least, to try to create some sort of strength and unity, given the fact that when it comes to what is happening to Renaissance, and especially during the parliamentary elections, there is severe weakness and severe perceived weakness as well.
Absolutely, and I think that the idea that they set aside their grievances, the kind of old guard led by Macron and the new guard led by Attal, is a bit of an illusion because again, Borne withdrew because she knew she had, because of his popularity, no chance of winning, but she negotiated her withdrawal with Attal so that he gave her a position of internal influence. She's going to be allowed to pick some key decision makers within the party and kind of run the party's internal parliament, if you will. So she's hoping, and her faction is hoping, that they will allow them to retain influence and essentially prevent Attal from turning this into a campaign machine for his presidential ambitions, which will involve undoing some of President Macron's signature policies. So they don't want to see that.
So let's come to those policies in a moment, but let's talk about the power play as well. I mean, what you've talked about there about trying to create some sort of unity, but very much we're talking about Élisabeth Borne, who many say was a sort of a sacrificial lamb when things went wrong for Renaissance, and Gabriel Attal even more so, because when Macron called this snap election in June, by all accounts, Attal was not kept up to date in the same way. And these are two characters who are sort of quite thrown under the bus by Emmanuel Macron. I mean, how much bitterness or how much rancor is there now as a result of this towards Macron?
Well, I think that there's a lot. And in fact, he's pretty much sidelined by all of the domestic politics that are happening in France. Renaissance are not the only ones, and Gabriel Attal, who are turning their attention to the 2027 elections. It seems so far away, but essentially, I think the consensus in the political class is that we are in an era of political sclerosis that won't allow anybody to achieve anything major, and so they're all just getting ready to jockey for position for this presidential race. So it's kind of a shame because the substance and the kind of policy agenda is going to play second fiddle to this politicking for the years to come.
Tell us a little bit more about what you mentioned a moment ago, the fact that Attal is going to mount a sort of a challenge to take over as a presidential candidate, but also in so doing, he will have to kill some of Macron's key policies. What is he prepared to do to make sure that Renaissance succeeds once again?
I think the only possible answer to that is that he's prepared to do anything. It is clear that he places his presidential ambitions very highly in his list of priorities, but he has also shown that he is not dogmatic. So I think he's going to read what the political headwinds are at any particular moment and make decisions based on that. But it is very clear that President Macron is now highly unpopular. Many of his signature policies, especially retirement reform, which raised the age of retirement from 62 years old to 64, are some of the most unpopular policies.
Paris Bureau Chief Simon Bouvier, you're listening to The Globalist. We head to the presidential elections because in Washington, D.C. yesterday, a group of dissidents and exiles from around the world gathered to discuss their political future ahead of next week's poll. Monocle's Chris Chermak has this report.
If Kamala Harris's rally in front of the Ellipse on Tuesday was designed to remind people of the threat Donald Trump posed to democracy, then the conference I attended yesterday was designed to show what happens if you lose that battle for democracy. The Renew Democracy Initiative, founded by Garry Kasparov, hosted the Frontlines of Freedom conference. bringing together political dissidents and exiles from around the world. These are people who have looked to the United States for inspiration in the past, but are concerned by the trends they see here today. People like Felix Maradiaga, former candidate for president of Nicaragua.
I am concerned, yes, because I know that the term shining city on the hill has been abused, sometimes taken out of context, but the truth, and every freedom fighter, every pro-democracy activist know that the United States has been a lifeline to human rights defenders around the world. I don't think that the world wants to follow China, Putin's Russia. The only way to truly have a vibrant democracy is through participation, through free and fair elections, and the elections in the U.S. are being watched by people around the world.
The advice that RDI offered the gathering dissidents was to serve as a mirror in their adopted homes for Americans as they consider their path forward. After all, every country's people assume that they're safe from authoritarianism until it's too late. For Monocle, in Washington, I'm Chris Chermak.
Thank you, Chris. And at 1800 London time, we'll be live from Atlanta, Georgia, because Monocle's team on the ground has arrived and is kicking off our election coverage across the United States for the next week. You're listening to The Globalist. 15:12 in Beijing, 7:12 a.m. here in London. Now, could Beijing be just about to issue an economic rescue package of almost $1.5 trillion? China's debt is rising with a property slump showing no signs of improvement, and deflation is persisting as well. So to explain what this means for China and for the rest of the world, I'm joined now by Steve Tsang, Director of the China Institute at SOAS University of London. Welcome back, Steve. Good to have you. Good morning.
Good morning, Emma.
So could you so comprehensively outline what the plans are? I mean, firstly, where is this money coming from? And secondly, where is it going to be deployed?
No, we don't know. I think that is the short answer to that. We know that a plan is likely to be hatched and announced probably next week, but we do not actually have all the details. We know that they are talking about altogether about 10 trillion yuan, which would be roughly what you said, about 1.5 trillion US dollar. The big question really is how that money will be spent and whether that money will be able to address the chronic problems underlying the economic underperformance of China in the last couple of years.
Just explain for us where it has gone wrong for China and why it needs such a huge amount of money to solve the problem.
Well, you have really a whole range of issues with the Chinese economy. Part of them are structural. The structural problems include the imbalance of the economy, that it has still been much more dependent on external trade and investment rather than domestic demands. Then you have the government policies to try to manage a soft landing of the real estate market, which resulted in the bursting of the property bubble, and therefore property prices having stayed in the doldrums for about 3 years, people feeling very much poorer, the general prospect of the economy no longer being very positive, so people are worried about their future and not wanting to spend money. You have now very serious unemployment of the young people. And you have also the issue of the government policy in terms of putting so much emphasis on specific pockets of excellence where China can develop innovative, cutting-edge sectors at the expense of the wider economy. So some of the most dynamic part of the Chinese economy, like the fintech sector, has been cut down as tall poppies. And the government will have to completely reverse that. And of course, you also have the problems of the increasing tension between China and the US and Europe and other Western economies, and they are less committed to invest in China, and Hong Kong is not doing well because of Chinese repression after the 2019 protest movements in Hong Kong. So the list goes on, and there's a lot that the Chinese government will have to get it right before they can actually make sure that the big stimulus package will actually deliver what will be needed.
Indeed. I mean, what you described there requires long-term strategies. And is there the expectation that this enormous amount of money could actually set the Chinese economy on the right track for the future? Or is it just simply fixing the problems that you were talking about? Because that's arguably slightly two different things.
I think you are absolutely right there, Emma. I think the package, if it is going to be in the scale that we have been led to believe it is, it will be a kind of a big bazooka. It will hit some of the problems that are existing. It will be a stimulus package that will restore some element of confidence. The atmosphere will change and people will feel a bit better and you will have some immediate effect. But the basic structural problems will not necessarily have been addressed. What really is important to bear in mind is that underlying the public confidence are not only the immediate government policy, but also the structural policy of Xi Jinping, that he does not believe in putting money in the hands of your average consumer. And he is not going to do the sort of things that will be required to fundamentally change the way how people in China feel. Even before all those problems that I mentioned earlier had come to the forefront, Chinese people have been very, very big savers. They are big savers because they don't really have a reliable and strong enough social security network to fall back on. If you were on a average working income and you fall ill without savings, you will not necessarily be able to go to a hospital to pay for the medical care you need. So you have a whole lot of that sort of issues that if they are not being addressed, you simply cannot build up the long-term confidence in the consumers to stimulate the domestic economy and domestic consumption, which is something that Xi Jinping wants. But he wants people to spend by his command, rather than people feeling that the future is secure. And of course, there's also the sense of lack of confidence about the future, and that is because people are not sure Xi Jinping has a good grip of the economic policies and will be able to steer the economy back to the steady growth that had been the case for China in the previous 40 years.
There has been some efforts, lots of efforts by Beijing to try to turn the economic corner. We've just had some news in the last couple of hours, actually, on Reuters, saying that to a certain degree, bits are working again. We've got the Chinese manufacturing activity expanding for the first time in 6 months, and services have picked up as well. I mean, is the Chinese economy partially helping itself out of this hole?
Well, it is, but then we are talking about the Chinese economy underperforming nearly persistently since the end of the COVID pandemic. So it has been underperforming for a very long time. So when you have a quarter or two of the economy doing a bit better, it certainly is a very positive step, but it is not enough. The government had already previously provided a smaller scale of stimulus, and therefore we're now seeing a bit of effect there in terms of how that is going to happen. So there will be more of that kind of positive news coming out in the next quarter or 2 or 3 if the big economic stimulus package is implemented. But as I say, that does not necessarily remove the basic problem that are undermining the vitality of the Chinese economy.
Tell us how the international reaction to China's manufacturing industry, to its exports, are actually affecting Beijing itself. I mean, we've seen in the last few weeks and months a very protectionist attitude taken towards Beijing by Washington. We are seeing tariffs being placed on the exporting from China to the European Union. We have an election next week in the US, which could perhaps bring a Trump administration back into the White House. What is China doing to mitigate against those threats?
Well, China is not doing anywhere near enough to mitigate those facts. I think Trump is a special case because Trump is going to do what Trump will do anyway. Not simply responding to whether China deals with the United States in a reasonable and positive way or not. But if you go beyond Trump, when you're dealing with the Biden administration or you are dealing with the European Union and the other major modern Western economies, then you have an issue that they have become very careful, perhaps even concerned about China's pockets of excellence in industries. As a result of Xi Jinping's policy, the policies are, one, China now acting very aggressively in China's foreign policy, and two, changing the economic paradigm from focusing on growth, as his predecessors did, to one that is focused on building up pockets of excellence that are innovative, globally competitive, and therefore potentially threatening to industries in the same sector in the Western economies. So you had, for 40 years, Europe, Japan, US, and elsewhere, intensely comfortable supporting China's economy to develop and grow very, very fast in a sustainable way, to one that they are now very concerned about particular Chinese sectors that are cutting edge, undermining the same sectors in the EU or elsewhere. EV is one, for example. Your battery is another example. So we're seeing Europe introducing tariff against China over the export of Chinese EVs, even at a time when the EU is meant to be working on a green agenda.
Steve Tang, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. Still to come on today's programme.
Today, many people are calling themselves witches as a positive thing. And I really like that idea when I've heard about the old accusations and then to hear that people use it in a positive way today.
We'll find out why Copenhagen is getting all hexy. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
7:24 here in London. Let's continue with the newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor. Good morning, Nina.
Good morning.
How are things in the Dos Santos world? What news?
Busy. I've been launching a new podcast called Control Alt Deceit: Democracy in Danger. I'm glad you like the name. You got the nod to the technological age we live in. Essentially, this particular podcast, which is we're doing with a BBC colleague, in conjunction with a new charity that's been set up to defend our democratic values. It's called Democratis. It's all about taking a look at sort of the attempts to control the narrative, particularly in the United States, and who's offering those alternative facts and where all this type of deception will lend us. Because what we know is that if America next week lunges towards autocracy, that'll be exported very much elsewhere and give other despots cover, let's face it.
There's a big question as well, is that lots of people nowadays, especially with the US elections, don't consider democracy to be actually that important a thing.
Well, they don't actually realise how much danger it's in. That's the problem. Time and time again, we see these surveys from whether it's the Pew Centre or whether it's, for instance, YouGov. There was a recent one. And we see on both sides of the Atlantic that people have less and less value and less faith in their democratic systems. But the whole point of this podcast is to try and understand how precious they are, how they're being targeted, which techniques are being employed. And also what I've learned throughout the course of this series is that not all of this malign influence is actually coming from outside of some of these big Western-led democracies. Take a look at what Elon Musk is doing. It's very much coming from within this time around.
Well, we wish you well.
Thank you.
Let's have a look at the papers. What have you picked up?
Well, let's start out with, for instance, a country that has become far less free since I first started covering it. That is, of course, Russia. A court in Russia, according to the Times of London here, but various other news outlets have reported this too because it's a big deal. No pun intended when you hear what I'm about to say. This court in Russia has fined Google, the US tech giant, wait for it, $20 decillion. Now that is, for any of us who aren't quite as good at maths as the people actually founded Google, or indeed the judge in this Russian court, as 20 followed by 33 zeros at the end. It's basically a symbolic amount that is the culmination of this 4-year-long court battle that Google has been having to defend itself against in the Russian courts after it banned a particular pro-Putin station on YouTube. It was called Tsargrad. That was back at the time when, you remember, there was the invasion of Crimea. And since then, obviously, Google doesn't do business in Russia anymore following the onset of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But this court fine has basically just kept accruing on a logarithmic scale, and it's reached this enormous number of $20 decillion that, by the way, is more than the estimated world's wealth combined. It's more than the number of grains of sand scientists think are on the planet, and more than the number of stars that you can see in the night sky at any evening when it's clear here in London. As I said, it's symbolic. Google can easily ignore it. But to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure why the Russian courts didn't actually go the full hog and find them one Google, which is obviously 1 followed by 100 zeros, the biggest number in the world.
There is an absurdity to it as well. But the lawyers from the Russian companies that have been trying to sort of seek to use international courts to chase Google for its assets said something, they had a sort of like a stoicism to it, for saying an old Russian proverb states, if you're afraid of wolves, don't go into the forest. For Google, the proverb might read, if you're afraid of the Russian legal system, don't do business in Russia. That is perhaps the simpler message that's being transmitted here rather than all the decillions.
Yes, that's right. But it's also a message that, frankly, is aimed at the Russian audience. And we know by now that lots of US businesses, as they've had to retrench because of, a ratcheting up of Western sanctions on Russia, those businesses have basically just been swallowed by Putin-connected cronies. So, it is one of those messages that we've heard time and time again from Russia. I suppose this sort of idea of, we're a proud nation, this is our economy, we're defending it. But the reality here is that, it is rather ridiculous when a court imposes a fine that is so enormous. I suppose critics of the Russian justice system would say this just goes to show that, justice is not free and fair in a country like that, particularly when it comes to commercial disputes. And we know that over the last 20 years, there have been many examples of Western firms who've been burnt by commercial disputes in Russia that have become increasingly brazen over the years.
Let's move on to a story in The Guardian about the city of Umeå in Sweden. A marvellous place if you're a woman.
Indeed, I'm glad that you pronounced this better than I did. But, considering as we're two women
I don't know what our Swedish audience would say.
There's no room for discord, is it? I mean, this is this utopian dream that The Guardian has sort of tried to feature in this lengthy read today. As you were saying before, it's this far north city in Sweden, about 400 miles north of Stockholm. It's just underneath the Arctic Circle. And it is one of those places where they celebrate feminism. It's one of the only places in the world where there's a dedicated statue to the Me Too movement, which is a snarling bright red puma. And the landscape itself has even been created in a sort of gender-friendly, female-friendly manner. They've landscaped it so there's more walkways for women. They've used the snow plough on the pavements because they say that women use pavements and their feet more than the men use cars. And so they've decided to plough the pavements more than they have the roads, which has irritated the male inhabitants, apparently. And, everybody from teachers to nursery assistants apparently is dedicated to teaching children how to smash the patriarchy for years to come. And if you look at the sort of the metrics here, if it were warmer, I'd go there on holiday, to be honest with you at this point, Emma. Crime is low and happiness is up. And I bet there's no divorces because of how to install IKEA flat pack furniture.
Well, you better not even sort of dare to cross these characters. It does sound like you have to sort of be absolutely on board by the time you get there. But also, it's got quite a lot of other sort of associated culturally interesting things. Everyone likes punk, apparently, which is quite fun. Even I'm just looking at the local tourist board, says that it has the beardiest and most heavily tattooed population in the world. This is pretty niche.
I'm not sure whether those are those the women? May well be. I don't know.
No. If you're in Umeå, you can contact Nina during in the usual channel. Maybe we should move away from that and head to a lovely story in The Independent, where everybody thought that a glass of wine at the end of the day is something just for humans. But no, animals like to drink as well.
That's right. Yeah, The Independent is quoting a bunch of scientists from the University of Exeter saying that essentially we've been getting this drinking culture thing all wrong where we think it's just us. Apparently the animal kingdom likes to tipple just as much as we do. And this is a phenomenon that goes all the way from our closest ancestors, monkeys, and in particular chimpanzees, who sometimes apparently seek out rather heavily fermented fruits. In particular, palm fruit apparently can contain 10.2% alcohol by volume, ABV. I mean, that's, quite strong stuff, isn't it? But it's not just mammals. It's also apparently fruit flies. And this one 2012 study actually backs this up, showing that male fruit flies were found to increase their alcohol consumption because of various social things that had happened to them, like, for instance, being rejected by a mate, whereas female flies, very similarly related species, were found to be less selective in their choice of mate after they had sought out and consumed ethanol. So, as you can see there, beer goggles and the great big rejection booze up apparently is not unique to us. It is also commonplace in the insecta phylum, apparently, according to these scientists.
Brilliant stuff. Nina dos Santos, thank you as ever for joining me in the studio. You're listening to Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is 7:33. Let's have a look at the headlines. Soldiers have joined the emergency rescue efforts in Spain, where the worst floods in decades have killed at least 95 people. It's not clear how many people are still missing. More than 150,000 households in the Valencia region are still without electricity. At least 19 people have died in Israeli airstrikes on the Lebanese city of Baalbek. The Israeli military had issued evacuation orders hours before the attack. More than 20 strikes were reported, 5 of which were on the interior of the city, where there is a UNESCO-listed ancient Roman temple complex. And North Korea has fired an intercontinental ballistic missile, recording the longest flight yet. The missile was airborne for 86 minutes and flew for more than 1,000 kilometres before it fell into waters off its east coast. And those are the headlines. Stay tuned. It's easy to forget, but the elections in the United States are not just a fight for the presidency. They're also about the shape of the House and the Senate. New York might appear safely Democrat on those fronts, but actually outside the city, there are some very tight races that could determine who has the majority in Congress, which is just part of the reason Donald Trump has held one of his most recent rallies in New York. Well, reporter Poppy Damon has been to Peekskill in Westchester County, upstate New York, to explore one such race where debate is dominated by Proposition 1, establishing whether rights to abortion should or shouldn't be enshrined in the state constitution. The singular issue has served as a microcosm for the culture war we've seen dominate the political landscape across the board.
Peekskill, New York. Population 25,000. One issue that dominates.
Proposition 1.
Proposition 1. Prop 1.
Peekskill is a riverside town in the Hudson Valley. It looks beautiful right now, autumnal leaves and surrounded by lakes. We arrive on a rainy day on a train from Manhattan. My editor Charlie and I are not familiar with the area, but luckily we have someone local who has agreed to show us around in his car.
Yes, where are your bikes?
Oh, you didn't tell him it was raining and we thought it was raining.
Fair enough. It might not be the weather for it.
That's John Scott Bennett.
I am a documentary filmmaker working on a docuseries on the Peekskill riots of 1949.
The riot he's referring to was in response to a concert by black singer Paul Robeson, who is well known for his strong pro-trade union stance, civil rights activism, and communist affiliations. John had previously had a film refused to be shown locally, The Tale of a Native American Massacre. The reason given?
It makes America look bad, which is kind of strange for a film about an event that took place 130 years before there was an America.
This idea that Peekskill is a place with a lot of anxiety about its politics started to become something palpable. It ran through every person we spoke to about Proposition 1, and maybe that's because of the swing nature of the politics here.
You'll see, signs all over the place of, Prop 1, yes, no Prop 1, Mondaire Jones, Mike Lawler, and it can go, house to house differences between, these two sides, very different stances, just right next to each other.
Mondaire Jones was the US representative for this district from 2001 to 2023. A Democrat and rising star of the left, he was defeated in 2022. He lost to a Republican, Mike Lawler. But he's back on the ticket to try and win his seat back.
I would say that anybody who wants to vote for Mike Lawler is going to vote no. Anybody who's going to vote for Mondaire Jones is going to vote yes.
We meet Tina Vols-Bonga and Hillary on the street corner outside a library where early voting is in full flow. They were there to remind voters that the amendment to Prop 1 was also on the ballot. Their bright yellow notice board reads, "Don't forget to flip your ballot," all in caps. The big pushback on this proposition, with signs to show it, is the idea that by not only protecting sex-based rights, but gender as well, this will mean trans women will have access to women's sports. But Tina and Hillary think this isn't how the amendment will be interpreted in practice, and this is all really about something else.
Yeah, I think it's fear, and so many lies are perpetrated because of the fear, and they win because people are so afraid.
Tina is clutching at her flyers tightly and calling out to people as they pass. She's hoping her presence will assuage those very fears. But what was very clear is that she's also worried about the Republican candidate Mike Lawler winning again.
What really drives me crazy is that he acts like he's a bridge to Trump. Well, I don't frankly feel like we need a bridge to Trump. And so
we need a bridge away from Trump.
Away from Trump. We need a bridge away. And then we need to figure out how we're going to talk to these people and live next to each other.
But Tina remains hopeful.
I think it's neck and neck, but I think it's going to be Mondaire Jones because I'm working like crazy to educate voters.
Tina's working like crazy because, as she tells me as we're leaving, she is in fact secretary to the Peekskill Democratic City Committee.
Love it. Thank you so much, ladies.
Across the road from Tina and Hillary and their signs is the library, where in the basement people are voting in a gentle but steady stream. We lurk in the corridors as voters exit. But what's immediately clear is just how divisive this election and Prop 1 are in this area. We're struck by the fact that people don't really want to talk about politics, not where people can hear them anyway.
Gonna vote no. A few reasons. Yeah, because it's very complicated, and I'm undecided about some local candidates as well, but I decided to vote no on that. But who knows, I might get there and say, no, I changed my mind.
We also had people shout at us from halls with both feet out the door.
Who did you vote for? Oh, that's my business, sir. I voted no on Prop 1, though. No. The language is too big. The language is too big.
And some people just seemed to warn me off the whole idea altogether.
Are you on your way to vote?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just a journalist. I'm just asking people how they're voting as they go in.
You're not supposed to.
We started to realise, like Tina told us, there are fears about what happens after all this. How are the people of Peekskill going to live side by side peacefully, whatever the outcome?
Oh, yeah. Well, what should we do? Take a walk down
We leave John behind and start to see if we get more people chatting to us when it's just Charlie and I, two Brits with a microphone, no local to hold our hand. After trying to chase down a truck with a Trump flag billowing from the back, another car pulled up. The driver is a man with a moustache and smoking a cigar. He told me he was a criminal attorney, and he was clear about one thing. He was voting no on Prop 1.
I'm worried about women's sports.
Oh, okay.
And women's rights.
And you're worried that?
That's going to hurt it.
Our activity on the high street is getting us noticed by a couple of men outside a barber's shop. One is Latino and a strong Trump supporter.
Come on, bro. I thought you were Donald Trump supporter.
They suggest we go to a business opposite run by a notorious Trump supporter. They promise he's sure is vocal and full of grievance about how hard it is to walk around in a MAGA hat. But he won't go on tape, which is sad given the passion with which he speaks about his views.
Oh my God, it made the best person win.
It's clear there is not a messy middle here. It's two sides talking to themselves. Trump voters feel persecuted, Liberals fearful and uncomprehending. Our friends then point us down the road to a local bakery, where there's a 30-year-old tradition of making cookies with candidates' faces printed in icing. Not unusual for a small-town bakery, but this year, things feel different.
So I'm in the bakery. I'm looking at the evenly split, I have to say, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris biscuits that are famous in this particular establishment. And I'm just waiting to see if the owner will speak to me about the election.
The biscuits depict Trump looking serious in his uniform red tie and Kamala smiling behind a US flag. Both have white frosting around the photographic image. Homestyle Bakery in Peekskill has been making cookies with the faces of political candidates on them for years, since Clinton, 92. Since then, the family-owned bakery, which has been in business for more than 50 years, has made butter cookies hand-cut and printed with the faces of every presidential candidate without incident. This year, however, they received hateful threats.
Some people didn't even want one of the candidates on the pan at all.
Jake, the owner, comes out to speak to me.
Over the years, nobody's ever said anything. This was the first time. I really can't say why they feel the way they do. But we never get involved. We don't take sides. We're just making cookies, trying to make everybody happy.
Do the desserts, do the biscuits, do the cookies predict the results in terms of sales?
I want to say I feel good about what we're selling of the mounds. I said, yeah, I don't want to say that, what it is, but I'm pretty sure.
You can call it.
Yeah.
You won't say.
I won't say.
With an issue as hot as Proposition 1, it seems in Peekskill voters are keeping their cards close to their chest for fear of reprisals for expressing their views, a sign perhaps of the political climate we live in, that even Republican and Democrat biscuits can't share a plate. Luckily for Jake, there is plenty else on the menu.
Apple, cherry, blueberry, peach, strudel.
For Monocle Radio in Peekskill, New York, I'm Poppy Damon.
Thank you so much, Poppy. You're with Monocle Radio. It's Halloween, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't noticed, so our thoughts today turn to ghosts and witches and all that unsettles. Now, witches are a mainstay of popular culture these days, but the Middle Ages weren't such a good time for them. Tens of thousands of women were tortured, burned and beheaded across Europe as the public was whipped up into a frenzy by the new communications medium, print, even in countries we think of today as progressive and moderate like Denmark. Well, our Copenhagen correspondent Michael Booth has been to visit a new exhibition in the Danish capital which uncovers the Nordic country's history of witches and draws interesting parallels with today's modern witch hunts.
I'm standing next to the very beautiful Caritas fountain on Gammeltorv and Nytorv, old and new squares, in the middle of Copenhagen. And there's lots of locals and tourists going about their business. All the Halloween decorations are out, of course, but I don't think most Danes really know what Halloween is, least of all that it is a one day, the 31st of October. Even fewer Danes would be aware that where I'm standing here next to this beautiful fountain, around about when it was built, this was also the main hotspot for the burning of witches. And now a new exhibition just across town is aiming to explore this dark period in Copenhagen's past. Oh, it gets cold when you come down here.
Yes, keep on your tickets. My name is Mirja Taulo and I'm a curator here at Christiansborg Palace in charge of exhibitions. There came a law, Christian IV, he made this new law in 1617, which was not only forbidding the evil magic, but also this good magic, you could say, that was curing people that were very much used in society at the time. The first one, the wise woman, she was called Maren Ringsbjerg. Then the other one that we meet is Christance Krukov, who was the only noble woman who was condemned as a witch. And the third one is called Maren Splits, and she was the wife of a rich tailor in Ribe in Jylland. She was brought here because she was tried at different courts, first at the city court, then the regional court, and then in the end at the high court, the king's court here at the castle.
It's a thorough legal process for the witches.
Very much, and there were all these laws that had to be followed.
And what kind of things were they doing? What kind of magic were they doing?
Yeah, that's very different, but we see, for example, Christance Krukov, the noble woman, she was accused of having made evil magic against another noble woman who lost a lot of children. The accusations were that she should have measured the wedding bed of this woman with a ribbon and tied a knot at this ribbon so to catch the luck of the marriage. And
guilty, obviously guilty.
Yes, and then she should also have made a wax child,
yeah,
like a little voodoo doll.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nordic voodoo.
Nordic voodoo, yes. That she should have carried under her arm in 40 weeks, like a pregnancy would last. She should have baptized it in the church with the help of a priest, given it the name of the other noble woman, Annabelle, and buried it under her chair in the church.
Oh, so she put in the work. I mean, this is a proper process that she went through.
These are the accusations against her, and actually in this first case she was found not guilty. Some servants were found guilty instead, but then later on in her life she was again accused of having made these wax children and other kinds of magic. That time she was old, she didn't have any male relatives to defend her. Women couldn't defend themselves at the court, so they had to get these male relatives to defend them. She was now old and totally alone, and then she was brought here to the castle and found guilty.
And then what?
And then she was actually executed by sword. Her head was cut off. Yeah, beheaded.
How many witches do we know of that were executed in Denmark in the 17th century?
Around 1,000.
Wow.
Yes.
I know in the exhibition you draw some kind of interesting parallels between the kind of collective psychosis that came over people and believing in magic back then and similar things that might happen today. I know that the witchcraft craze was partly fueled by the printing press. Is something similar happening, do you think, with social media?
Yes. You could say what happened there at this time in the beginning of the 17th century was that it was an orthodox period religiously, that the theologians, the priests, were telling the king that the day of judgment was very near. So the devil was out to hire allies in the final battle against God. So it was the king's job as the protector of the realm to find all these allies of the devil and to to get rid of them, because otherwise God would punish the entire kingdom with illness and war and different catastrophes. Yeah, so we make this parallel to what can happen today when the people who are in power today here at Christiansborg Palace at the Parliament, a crisis comes, like the Corona crisis that happened, and they had to make very acute new laws. They didn't know what would happen with these laws, what consequences they would have, but all the experts, the virologists, would come and give them their advice based on their newest knowledge.
Is it politically incorrect to call them witches?
Yeah, we would actually more call them accused of witchcraft.
Yeah, that's better, yeah.
So here we see the three different witches in the scenography that is composed out of a lot of strings.
It's properly spooky, isn't it? It's like massive cobwebs and ghostly ghouls hanging from the ceiling.
Yeah, and you can say they were sort of entangled in this cobwebs of belief in witchcraft at the time. They are entangled in it. So here you can see the way they were telling fortune. For example, the wise woman, Maren Ringsbjerg, was to put very hot lead into cold water so that it would make some weird figures, and then she would interpret these figures as some kind of omen, what would happen in your future.
Do you believe in magic, Mia?
Actually not really, but I think it's really, really interesting to hear about how they did it back in the old time, or what people believed other people did. And also that today many people are calling themselves witches as a positive thing. And I really like that idea when I've heard about the old accusations, and then to hear that people use it in a positive way today.
For Monocle in Copenhagen, I'm Michael Booth.
Thank you, Michael. The Power and Magic exhibition is open in Copenhagen until April next year. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Time for a quick spin around the fashion world with Dana Thomas, journalist and author of Fashionopolis, The Price of Fast Fashion and the Future of Clothes. She joins us from Paris. Good morning, Dana. How's Paris?
Good morning. Everything is fine, just fine.
Delighted to hear it. Let's talk about Prada.
Yes, Prada. Well, Prada is funny because Prada was, the hottest brand of the 1990s. And 30 years on, the hottest brand really in fashion, hot, white hot, is its secondary line, Miu Miu, which was named after Miuccia Prada. And they launched this company, this line about 25 years ago. I remember buying it as when it first came out, as a secondary line that was supposed to be less expensive and sort of more accessible. It took a while for it to hit, but boy, has it hit. So this week, they announced that sales doubled in the third quarter. And for the year, it has increased. It rose by 105% year on year from a year ago. I mean, this is enormous sales. What's fueling the sales, funny enough, or at least what got it really going, was these tiny little mini skirts. Like, they're basically a wide belt that you wear around your waist. They're so tight. There's so many skirts. They're not really skirts. They're like ruffles. And they sell between $1,000 and $3,000 a piece. These tiny things. And they are just the look for young people. Where they get the money to buy them, I don't know. But they do, and they're buying a lot of this.
There's quite a lot of spending in China, not China,
Yeah.
I should say Japan and China still.
Japan and China. And if you think about the cute little mini skirt, it feels like very sort of young Chinese girl, young Japanese girl, because those girls, they still dress. They really dress, and they dress in a quirky, high fashion way that's kind of fun in ways that we don't dress in Europe anymore, where it's all, I don't even know what it is. So it's selling like crazy. And so this very simple, accessible and at one time affordable secondary line is outpacing the main show, the main line.
It's great to have Prada back and Miu Miu too. Dana Thomas, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now she's got a yellow waterproof Ramblers jacket, muddy boots and big blue eyes. I'm not talking about my next guest, Juliet Linley, journalist and former Vatican correspondent, but the Vatican City's new anime-inspired mascot called Luce. Juliet, welcome. You were on the line from Dufourstrasse 90.
Hello, Emma. Yes, good morning from Zurich.
Do you have your yellow jacket on just like Luce?
Yes, of course. And my gumboots, my muddy gumboots, because I am a pilgrim.
Excellent. Yes, I did fail to mention the fact that she has a rather splendid crucifix going around there, so going around her neck as well, which gives you the major clue of what she's trying to symbolise.
Yeah, so isn't this interesting? Every 25 years, it's a jubilee year. It's a holy year for the Catholics. And traditionally, over the centuries, the Vatican has always commissioned design creations, Catholic creations. So I'll give you one example. The Sistine Chapel's Last Judgment fresco, that was commissioned to mark the holy year in 1475. And none other than Michelangelo did it. And then you've also got Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who designed a bronze baldacchino inside St. Peter's Basilica in the 1600s. Well, today, here's what the Pope is doing. In order to attract Gen Z to Catholicism, in order to bring young blood into the fold, he's breaking with tradition completely, and they've unveiled a mascot of all things rather than a Renaissance fresco. And it's designed in modern Japanese anime style.
There's this interesting thing now so we're now bringing in a very Japanese look, and she's going to Luce will make her debut at a comic convention in Lucca next week. And this is the first time that the Vatican set up a stall in a place like that, isn't it?
It's incredible. And it's designed by an Italian pop artist, Simone Legno, but it is very much in Japanese style. And he has a lifestyle brand which is inspired by Japan, and it's called Tokidoki, which means once in a while or sometimes in Japanese. And Luce is there to sort of live even within the pop culture beloved by our youth, as the Vatican is putting it. And yeah, it's also going to debut in Osaka at the Expo next year in 2025 as the Vatican's mascot. And she'll be promoting the theme of beauty, bringing hope. But you know, Emma, there are some critics. Do you want to hear about what they're saying?
I'm absolutely agog. Yes, please do. Because it is a bit different, isn't it?
It's very different. I mean, you've got traditionalists saying, wait, the youth used to be inspired by noble models like St. Dominic Savio and his motto, death rather than sin. And maybe you could put a version of St. Peter rather than this chibi Japanese style. But then others are saying, get with the picture. The Catholic Church needs to modernize and to get rid of its musty, dusty image, and how better than with Luce.
Do we know what they're going to do with Luce? Because she's not on her own, is she? She's got some buddies. We've got a little bird. We've got an angel that's wearing a baseball cap, a dog with an excellent neckerchief with a tiny little crucifix on it. And one wonders, are we all going to be sporting Luce and her pals' T-shirts?
We might, and stickers, and there'll be posters around the Holy City, and you'll be visiting St. Peter's Square, and maybe you might be given a yellow raincoat, who knows? But it is all an attempt at really bringing in more Catholics, because the Christian population is dwindling. I mean, it's projected to drop by 100 million within the next sort of 40 years in Europe, and also in the States. In 1970, 90% of Americans called themselves Christians. Now it's down to 64. By 2070, some are saying the majority in the US will not be Christian. So that's what the Vatican is focusing on.
Juliet Linley, I shall see you in Zurich wearing our Luce T-shirts at some stage. Thank you so much for joining us on the line from Dufourstrasse 90. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers, Anita Riotta, Laura Kramer and Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Sana Jumani and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday here in London, and The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. Hope you can join me for that if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.